If you want to know about the connection between childhood trauma and adult disease, this is the book I would highly recommend. Scared Sick.
I mean, the reality is that there are many things that we've sort of built in subtly to our culture that are highly traumatic to babies, and we aren't aware of it. For example, gestating in a highly stressed mommy bathes the baby's brain in the very same chemicals of stress that she's experiencing in her own life. So babies can actually come into the world traumatized. Prematurity. A baby who comes into the world too soon goes to a NICU, and obviously this is a life-saving environment. But in the NICU, because that little nervous system is so raw and so unready for the world outside of mom's womb, the baby actually experiences between 10 and 15 events of extreme pain every day in the NICU. So again, the brain is thrown into overload. If that baby goes home with a loving, nurturing family, that can be healed. But so often babies who are born too soon, the teen mommy and an impoverished, stressful situation, it becomes true that there are a chronic series of traumatic experiences. Baby might be left randomly with various people, the attachment broken between mom and the baby often, may go to child care that's insensitive. I mean, there are many things along the way, and it's never just one thing. I want to be really clear. It's the chronicity. It's chronic exposure to fear-inducing situations that take the brain off course.
What that means is the first 270 days in utero, and then the 2 years after, add those three numbers up, and you get essentially from conception to about through the end of into the second year. It's the second year. Pass through year one and at the end of year two. So by their thoughts, it's the first 1,000 days. It's not only prenatal, but also all through year one and all through year two that are really the essential time that is there for the shaping, notice, of our emotional selves and social brain. So I had said earlier that one of the major pediatricians, Barry Brazelton, who still is alive, had talked about how long should the baby stay with the mother. And he was saying 2 years. That comes to this whole period of time here, which essentially is the time of the right brain growth spurt, and then coming into the left hemisphere growth spurt. And I referred to this also this morning, the phenomenal progress of the past 3 decades in the developmental neurosciences. Over the past decade, it has become abundantly clear that the in utero and immediate postnatal environments and the dyadic relationships, the reciprocal relationships between the child and the caregivers, between the child and the caregivers within the first years of life, notice going through the end of year 2, can have direct and enduring effects on the child's brain development and behavior. And they went on to say, I'll repeat this, the enduring impact of early maternal care and the role of epigenetic modification of the genome during critical periods in early brain development, in health and disease, is likely to be one of the most important discoveries in all of the sciences that have major implications for our field. This clearly establishes the critical importance of the first 1,000 days of life, a period that extends from fetal development to infancy in the first year and then into toddlerhood in the second year. Due to the fact that the early maturation of the brain requires social experiences, Infants and toddlers have unique and essential social, emotional, and mental health needs. Fetal and postnatal social experiences also impact all later development. And incidentally, the needs of the infant at 6 months and at 12 months are very different. Some of these are the same about the continuity of development, but these needs are very different than, let's say, a 3-year-old child. A 3-year-old child who's got both hemispheres, etc., and who's gone through the longer stage of development. I said also that brain development is not just genetically encoded. It's not just the genes that shape this particular brain. It needs these social experiences from the caregivers. And as I said, Mother Nature and Mother Nurture combine to shape human nature. So when I'm no longer looking at, is that nature or is that nurture? Is that biological or is that psychological? We're talking here about psychobiological development. From birth, these epigenetic factors in the social environment that impact the genome, that's to say that the mother is affecting more than the behavior. She's actually affecting the genes themselves and how they are being expressed, especially the genes that are encoding the synapses in the brain and that are encoding the myelinization of the brain. These are created within the mother-infant attachment relationship. So again, I'm using regulation theory, an interpersonal neurobiological model of precisely how emotional attachment experiences shape this early developing emotional, social right brain. In 2012, I wrote that attachment theory, first created by John Bowlby after over 50 years ago, is now revitalized, particularly by its deep connections with neuroscience. At this point in time, we have an attachment theory, a coherent theory of development that is grounded in both psychological science and neuroscience, and thereby is on a much firmer ground than it used to be. It used to be just purely a behavioral theory.
The right side dominates development through the end of the child's 3rd year. After birth, when spoken language begins to flourish and stimulates growth on the left side. So, in spite of the fact that language is primarily the domain of the left hemisphere, linguistic development actually begins in the right hemisphere, with the infant's orientation to the face, voice, and gestures of the caregiver. For our infant selves, learning is fundamentally emotional. Cognitive learning will follow, and its success has everything to do with how well early caregivers have facilitated emotional regulation in the baby. In the beginning, life is all about feelings and sounds, tastes and textures, images and gestures, all of which is processed and stored in implicit memory in the right hemisphere. Not surprisingly, then it is also our mother's right hemisphere that needs to attune and respond. Gestures, smells, touch, faces and sounds, especially prosody, the lilting tones and tempos that babies inspire, are the language of the baby and the attuned parent. Although most language is processed through the later developing left hemisphere, the early dominant right hemisphere, the seat of our unconscious perceptions, remains central to the most critical aspects of social communication throughout our lives and the core of our relationships. Much faster than the left side, the right orbitofrontal cortex continues to connect incoming sensual data from the cortex with our simultaneously occurring awareness of our internal physical and emotional states. Here is the seat of our gut reactions, our intuitive feelings about people and situations. If you are an empathizer, that feeling of discomfort in the face of someone else's suffering is registering in this part of your brain, and it began when someone was there for you as a baby, who responded sensitively to your cries and needs, comforted you, and gave you a sense of connection to another person. The quick contingent response of the caregiver, her ability to read the baby's intended message and to act on it, the warmth of her response, the availability of eye contact, soothing sounds and gestures, all formed the basis for feeling of connectedness by the baby to the caregiver and shaped the baby's model for future relationships. If this foundation is missing, empathy can be compromised or lost to a child and to our world, but that's not all. The right orbitofrontal cortex also controls and modulates the primary emotions, including and perhaps especially fear. The right brain is more deeply interconnected than the left hemisphere with the autonomic limbic and arousal systems, including the vagus nerve, and it plays a stronger role than the left in the production of cortisol and in key immune, endocrine, and cardiovascular functions. So, here in the right brain is the seat of the circuitry, modulating both sympathetic and parasympathetic functions. The right orbitofrontal brain governs the autonomic nervous system, because orbitofrontal feedback assessing the level of threat provides the calming of extreme fear states. A person with an impaired orbitofrontal system is susceptible to pathological states of dissociation when stressed. Dysregulation of this feedback loop places the person at the mercy of an amygdala-driven defensive state longer than is healthy.
But along the way, I'll be given consequences, yes. The second theme is self-regulation. The emphasis is not only on emotion, but emotion regulation. Not only the ability to have experiences of emotion, to feel joy, to feel interest, excitement, to feel fear, to feel positive and negative emotions, but essentially what is evolving over the first 2 years is the ability to regulate those emotions. Each of us has the capacity now to regulate the emotion here. And therefore, in one sense, the whole field of child development is about the enhancement of this capacity for self-regulation. I'll talk more about this. This attachment promotes self-regulation. It allows new and more complex, resilient, and relational interactions between the individual and the social environment. So again, not only the ability to have emotions, but the ability to form strong relations with other human beings. Again, this would be the right brain throughout the rest of the lifespan. But the self-regulation is also tied to stress regulation. And as I'll mention here, the major circuits in the brain that are involved in regulating our state when we're frightened, the ability now to down-regulate it from intense fear to modifiable fear that we can tolerate, or joy, etc., is due to stress regulation. The major stress regulation of the brain is on the right side of the brain, not the left side of the brain. And affect dysregulation, emotional dysregulation, in the critical period of the right brain development is associated with the origin of emotional disorders. So that if the child is extremely dysregulated by the caregiver, etc., that is going to be the building grounds for later emotional disorders. The third theme is that developmental neuroscience is now actively exploring brain growth spurt. The brain goes through a growth spurt where it more than doubles in size from the last trimester in pregnancy through the end of the second year. And it's this period here that is also the early development of the right brain. The first 1,000 days is a period of maximal neuroplasticity, that the synapses, the myelinization, etc., the maximal growth of the brain. At no other point in the lifespan does the brain grow as rapidly as this, and all of this rapid growth, which begins in the third trimester, is being influenced by the social environment. The pregnant mother's emotional state influences this fetal brain growth. If she is constantly in a depressed state, that will influence the growth of the brain. If she is dysregulated, if her anxieties, etc., will influence the brain growth. This maternal emotional stress in the prenatal period also affects brain growth. We know that if she's very stressed in utero, that this will also affect it. And as I said this morning, these stress hormones, such as corticotropin releasing factor and corticosteroids, cross the placenta, and on the other side of the placenta is the baby's growing brain, etc., and they're going to have an effect on that brain. I showed this very quickly this morning here. You see the connections here between the mother's brain into the fetus, and you see also estrogen and progesterone within the body are being sent into the placenta there also. But notice it's the mother's hypothalamic pituitary gland, which is the key one that is producing the stress hormones there. And then essentially it's her right brain which is more connected to the emotional state of the infant in the fetus, etc. And here you're seeing some of the same areas, the orbitofrontal cortex at the very front, the cingulate cortex that goes around there, then the nucleus accumbens, dopamine, etc., the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, etc. It's these central parts of the mother's brain that are influencing this. It is not her left hemisphere, and it is not her executive function. It's the emotional right. Indeed, in the prenatal and the postnatal periods, the brain growth rate is 40,000 new synapses every second. So this is the work of Colwyn Trevarthen, the Scottish neuroscientist. The right hemisphere is more advanced than the left in surface features from about the 25th gestational week, the last trimester, and this advance persists until the left hemisphere shows a postnatal growth spurt starting in the middle of the second year. So this attachment relationship is occurring in this period of the accelerated growth of the emotional right brain, and the attachment experiences are shaping the brain's capacity for emotional and social functions throughout life.
Sometimes a history of trauma is apparent. More often it is not. Symptoms of trauma: anxiety, nightmares, social withdrawal, emotional numbing, reflect a narrowing of behavioral repertoires to avoid aversive internal sensations, a sort of psychological inflexibility that results in our feeling removed from being present in minute-to-minute reality. We may have flashbacks, phobias, depression, insomnia, unstable moods, aggression, delusional thoughts, substance abuse, chronic pain, and disease. While a traumatic brain injury from a physical blow shows up on an MRI, emotional trauma seldom does. To make things more complicated, the memory of the trauma may be hidden, unavailable to one's conscious mind, yet the repercussions are similar: dissociation or chronic hypervigilance, or both. The resulting dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system will set off a chain of physical aftershocks in bodily systems: digestive, respiratory, cardiovascular, immune, and endocrine. Diseases of trauma fall at the extreme end of the continuum that begins with stress-related diseases. Traumatic diseases are those that result from chronic perceptions of helplessness and hopelessness, added to toxic stress, leading to the overstimulation of the autonomic nervous system. We might think that being exposed to high degrees of stress early in our lives would inoculate us against later difficulties, but the opposite is true. Chronic stress sensitizes our nervous systems, rendering us more vulnerable to trauma later. Children who experience early abuse or trauma are particularly susceptible to its diseases. They may look for years like exceptional little stress cadets and are often called resilient. In fact, disease usually surfaces around middle age, though it may have been well underway earlier. Disease may also not appear until relatively late in life. Chronic stress early in our lives resets our arousal system to a more sensitive level, renders us reactive to a broader range of stressors, and compromises our ability to adapt flexibly to later life stresses. Inhibition of the freeze response, inherent in humans, places a person in a sustained state of entrapment, similar in its impact to the capture and caging of wild mammals. In his courageous book, The Trauma Spectrum, Dr. Scaer asserts that, unfortunately for our species, our cages are often cultural and of our own making. We humans often live under conditions that are simultaneously constructive and destructive for our health, like working under abusive conditions to pay our bills, or continuing in toxic relationships to provide security for children. Such situations often generate prolonged hopelessness that has as disastrous an impact on our health as an acutely traumatic event. Dr. Scaer defines diseases of trauma as those that uniquely reflect the seesaw cycling of both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Both the adrenaline-driven sympathetic division that stimulates heart rate and raises blood pressure, and the cortisol-driven parasympathetic division that returns the body to rest and digest, are involved in the strangely cycling symptoms of trauma. The unregulated oscillation of these processes is the hallmark of trauma-related diseases, Scaer says. The symptoms of trauma are bimodal. You have flashbacks, panic, anxiety attacks, terror. And you have dissociation, which is numbing out, and avoidance, retreat, and depression. That's been the conundrum of the whole diagnosis of PTSD. You have symptoms that are both arousal-based and freeze-based. Any therapist will tell you that if you kick off a traumatic memory, the person becomes panicky and then goes suddenly into this dissociative state. As I look at the so-called psychosomatic syndromes of my patients that nobody understands, they all have parasympathetic and sympathetic dominant states. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, GERD, all are characterized by cyclical autonomic dysregulation. Scare has particular sympathy for sufferers of fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. A neurologist with 30 years of experience in trauma and rehabilitative medicine, Scare says, these patients have been poorly understood, poorly treated, and often dismissed as hypochondriacs. It is common, he says, for practitioners of Western medicine, with the exception of rheumatologists, who specialize in these syndromes, to view these patients as suffering psychosomatic illnesses. The symptoms, hard to measure objectively and hard to remediate, include diffuse skeletal pain, points of tenderness across the body's surface, morning stiffness, daytime fatigue, and interrupted sleep. Victims of fibromyalgia experience many fluctuating symptoms of autonomic dysregulation, including numbness, tingling, hypervigilance, emotional instability, dizziness, and cognitive impairment. Scare believes that fibromyalgia reflects preverbal trauma that is difficult to document. The muscle pain, he notes, is probably the result of tightening muscles during REM sleep, in which the patient is reenacting the traumatic event.
Dr. Robert Scare is a neurologist and internationally recognized trauma researcher and lecturer based in Boulder, Colorado. His books include The Body Bears the Burden, Trauma, Dissociation, and Disease, and The Trauma Spectrum, Hidden Wounds and Human Resiliency. He also maintains the website traumasoma.com, where he has many articles suitable for physicians and lay people alike. I had the opportunity to have a frank, intimate conversation with Bob about the new traumatology, the trauma spectrum, and its implications for individuals and society alike. We met in Boulder, Colorado in 2010. Bob, I've got two books. One, The Body Bears the Burden, which I understand has two editions.
Yes, that's first edition.
First edition is what I have here, which I'm proud to say I made it through.
Congratulations!
Right, in my earliest times, I came into this and I was like, this is painful. It was challenging. And I sat in San Diego County, reading this many pages over and over again. But I understand the new version, the second edition, has kind of been rewritten for more accessibility for other people, or?
Yes, I rewrote most of the book to make it more lay user-friendly.
Right. So that's like not just added sections per se, but actual terminology readjusted or explanations put in.
Oh yes, and different phraseology and different terms, and all the medical terms are explained. I wrote the first book for doctors, as a document that I hoped someday somebody would read and would change their minds. But I wrote it for physicians, and therefore I put it in medicalese.
Certainly you did. The language that medical doctors would be most appreciative to, like, say, oh, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Right. Well, I'm excited that was there and that I could get through that. And then you also did the trauma spectrum, hidden wounds, and human resiliency. That's kind of, sometimes I think of this as kind of your more independent thinking on the subject. Is that?
Yes, it is. There were some new ideas I needed to bring out, which prompted the second book. And the original title I proposed was Trauma Tells the Tale.
Trauma tells the tale.
Understanding Your Life.
Uh-huh. Oh, wow. Quite a more personal direction there.
Because I felt by this time that trauma was ubiquitous. It affected all of us in some ways. That everybody experienced this phenomenon in their lives, and that it had a profound effect on all of their life choices.
Right. Well, that's great. I think that's probably exactly where we're going to get to. Right. So let's kind of review just on the way there, though. Who are you? You're a neurologist. You ran a pain clinic in Boulder, Colorado for some 20 plus years.
Yeah, I was acting medical director of a rehabilitation center.
Okay.
Which means that during the course of that 20 years, I directed almost all of the programs at one time or another, including a chronic pain program.
Uh-huh. And so you were in charge of doctors, you were in charge of treatment plans, treatment protocols. You also met with patients themselves, I suppose?
Yeah, I directed programs and did a lot of administrative meetings and also clinical meetings with teams, various teams.
Mm-hmm.
Brain injury program, pediatric rehabilitation, inpatient rehab, chronic pain, sports medicine.
Just about everything that we would normally end up associating now, at least with the new traumatology, with things that would kind of be in that field. So you had a long history of kind of working in what eventually gets around to traumatic stress issues.
It did, because rehabilitation implies that there has been an event which has been physically, cognitively, or emotionally disabling to some extent, and which requires rehabilitation.
Precisely.
And from the start, I brought in psychologists. The rehab center did not have a psychologist, and ultimately all the programs had a psychologist because I recognized the emotional content associated with disability.
So from the start, in some way, you were already kind of taking maybe a different approach?
Well, most large rehabilitation centers have psychological support systems.
Okay.
They hadn't really gotten around to that when I took over in 1980.
1980.
Yeah.
And before that, you were trained as a medical doctor, neurologist, so brain science kind of stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I practiced that for 11 years.
And you practiced that for 11 years.
Right.
So, in the general sense, we can say, as far as we understand it, within the field, you've been trained in terms of how the brain works, what it does, and when you see abnormalities, what part of the brain might be at issue there, not functioning ideally.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
We also did orthopedic rehabilitation, and hip replacements and that sort of thing.
Right.
But a good part of it was neurological rehabilitation.
Good part of it was neurological.
Right.
And I take it that at some point along your career path there, some kind of shift took place where you started looking with a different lens in terms of what was going on within the brain processing of your clients, your patients, and how would be best, what methods would be best to treat them. That's true?
That's right. The last 6 years I took over the direction of the chronic pain program. The physician who'd been doing it left, and I had trouble recruiting somebody, so I took it over and actually enjoyed it. And while I was doing that, and even before then I'd known that, I realized that severe emotional distress was common in chronic pain patients. It makes sense.
Makes sense.
However, there was a disproportionate number who suffered from what we call axis 2 diagnoses, personality disorders, And the one that was most prominent was borderline personality disorder.
Really, the flip-flop back and forth between, how would you describe that, borderline personality? It's kind of like...
It's a state of severe emotional dysregulation with periods of rage, periods of terror, periods of profound depression.
And then elation as well?
No.
No.
Unfortunately, never elation.
No, never elation.
Mostly negative emotional instability.
Right.
And there was also a manipulative aspect and also a self-preservation aspect.
So you were kind of seeing that behavior. What would your original model have suggested about what was going on here? People were defiant, or they were kind of resistant, or what would have been the...
There was no basis in the literature for the understanding of why this personality disorder would be predisposed to developing chronic pain.
Huh.
And it was a puzzle. And we thought it was psychological, but we didn't know what the mechanism was.
And you would have active conversations about it?
All the time.
Right, all the time.
Because we had to protect the staff integrity, because there was a constant effort to turn us against each other.
Right.
It was a challenge. And borderline personality disorders are a challenge in the psychotherapy field, and they're well known to create chaos. But why? That was the question.
Right.
And I had no idea why, and until one of my therapists gave me an article by Peter Levine.
Do you remember which one that was?
It was one of his standalone articles on his work. And I read the article and I thought, this explains my chronic pain patients.
Just like that?
Yeah. I said, this describes the borderline personality disorder frequently, where there are multiple somatic complaints, and it describes me to a certain extent.
You personally?
Yes. I applied it to my own life experience, my method of coping with things, my way of thinking, and I recognized that there were things about this that I participated in too.
Health is about the regulation of key systems in our bodies. Healing from trauma is not just about controlling symptoms, but also about promoting the balanced regulation of vital systems in our own bodies and in the developing bodies of our children. This concept is fundamental to the newer trauma therapies. Unlike traditional therapies that rely chiefly on talk, several new techniques address not just cognitive and emotional processing, but physical processing as well. This is not to imply that more traditional forms of therapy, for example cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), which has been shown to be effective with PTSD, are not helpful for trauma, or to overlook the fact that many individual practitioners of classical forms of therapy have integrated an understanding of body-centered work into their practices. But most traditional talk therapy, while grounded in an understanding of the formative role of childhood, often fails to access traumatic experiences that occurred before we could speak. Moreover, many traditionally trained therapists are uncomfortable working directly with the body. The good news is that the new generation of therapeutic skills are now available that are designed to treat the brain and the physical impact of trauma, including early trauma, either separately or as an adjunct to a more traditional approach like CBT. In these therapies, there is recognition of the role of implicit and unconscious memory. The techniques target the integration of physical sensations, feelings, gestures, postural changes, and other physical signals associated with stored trauma. The common denominator in these approaches is a combination of the gradual recall of traumatic memories exposure with relaxation techniques designed to modulate dysregulated bodily systems. Francine Shapiro, creator of eye movement desensitization and reintegration EMDR, puts it this way. When a memory of a past event is functionally stored, it is in declarative or narrative memory. If it is dysfunctionally stored, it is in motoric memory and retains the physical sensations and high level of affect that was there at the time of the event.